Consider for a moment what the world sounded like in 1847. There were no recorded voices, no way to capture sound itself and hold it like water in a cup. A human voice traveled only as far as lungs could push it through air, perhaps 100 meters on a quiet day, less in a crowded street. If you wanted to speak to someone beyond that invisible boundary, you walked to them, or you sent paper with ink scratches that represented sound without carrying it. The human voice, that most intimate expression of consciousness, was a prisoner of distance. When someone you loved traveled beyond the horizon, their voice vanished from the world as completely as if they died. This was simply how reality worked, how it had always worked, how everyone assumed it would always work. But in Edinburgh, in a household obsessed with the mechanics of speech itself, a child was being born who would teach voices how to fly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Alexander Graham Bell, they'd call him Alec in the family, entered a world where sound was already sacred, already mysterious, already the subject of almost religious devotion. His grandfather, Alexander Bell I, had transformed theatrical elocution from art into science, teaching actors and clergymen precisely how to shape their mouths and breathe from their diaphragms to fill vast halls with perfectly articulated words. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, had taken this obsession deeper, inventing something he called visible speech, a written code showing exactly how the tongue, lips and soft palate must position themselves to create every sound the human mouth could make. It looked like alien hieroglyphics, these strange symbols representing the invisible architecture of speech, but it worked. Show someone these symbols, and they could speak languages they'd never heard, could pronounce words from cultures they'd never encountered. Because the code described not meaning, but pure mechanical sound, the Bell House in Edinburgh smelled of ink and ambition. Papers covered every surface, diagrams of mouths in cross-section, tongues curled against teeth, airways opening and closing. But there was music too, because Alec's mother Eliza played piano with a passion that filled rooms with beauty. She'd learned as a girl before the deafness came. It arrived slowly, stealing frequencies one by one. First the high notes disappeared, then middle tones grew muffled, then everything became quieter, as if the world was walking away from her while she stood still. By the time Alec turned 12, his mother's world had gone completely silent. No music, no voices, no birdsong or rain or wind, nothing. This could have been simple tragedy, a sad fact of existence before modern medicine. But young Alec discovered something extraordinary. If he pressed his lips directly against his mother's forehead and spoke in very low tones, she could understand him. Not through her ears, which no longer functioned, but through her skull itself. The vibrations of his voice traveled through bone and tissue to reach whatever remained capable of sensing sound deep in her head. It was their secret language, this intimate transmission, his lips on her forehead, speaking truths and jokes and love directly into her brain. And in those moments, Alec learned something the rest of the world didn't yet know. Sound wasn't just air moving. It was energy seeking any path to reach the human soul. The Bell household became a laboratory where life and death conducted their experiments side by side. When Alec was 15, he and his older brother Melville built an automaton in the attic. They molded a rubber tongue, constructed a wooden mouth with movable lips, attached bellows for lungs, and spent weeks adjusting the mechanism until it could cry, "Mama!" in a voice so convincing that neighbors rushed upstairs, thinking a baby had been trapped in the walls. The brothers would demonstrate their creation like proud magicians, making this dead thing speak, proving that voice was just mechanics. Push air through shaped spaces, and you create the sounds humans call language. But while they were teaching machines to speak, death was teaching them about silence. Tuberculosis had found the Bell family. It was called consumption then, because it consumed people from the inside, turning lungs into drowning pools of fluid and blood. The disease moved through families like an intelligent predator, patient and thorough. Edward, the youngest Bell brother, fell ill in 1866. He was just 18 years old, full of the same brilliance that marked all the Bell men when the coughing started. Then came blood on handkerchiefs, then fever. Then the desperate gasping for air while lungs filled with fluid. Alec watched his younger brother die slowly. Over months, watched Edward try to speak words that his drowning lungs couldn't form properly. Watched meaning trapped in a body that could no longer transmit it. On May 17, 1867, Edward Bell stopped breathing. He was 19 years old. The family buried him and tried to continue. Tried to pretend that consumption wasn't stalking them all. But grief has weight, and it pressed down on everyone differently. Melville threw himself into work, helping his father develop the visible speech system, teaching at their school. But the cough that began quietly in 1869 grew louder through 1870. He ignored it until ignoring became impossible. The same script, first coughing, then blood, then fever, then the long struggle for breath. On May 28, 1870, Melville Bell died. He was 25 years old. Two brothers dead in 3 years, both drowned in their own lungs, while their family watched helplessly. And now Alec, the middle brother, the survivor by default, began coughing too. He was 23 years old, the last living son, and his father made a decision born of desperation. They would flee. Canada had cleaner air, everyone said. The New World's wilderness might save what remained of the family. It was superstition masquerading as reason. But what else could a father do while consumption reached for his last child? So in August 1870, the Bells crossed the Atlantic, Alec coughing blood into handkerchiefs he burned every night. His mother, silent in her deafness. His father carrying the weight of 3,000 miles of ocean and 2 dead sons, and the terrible hope that distance might outrun death. The voyage took 2 weeks, waves like mountains, Alec spending nights on deck breathing salt air, wondering if he was traveling towards salvation or just crossing the ocean to die somewhere else. They landed in Quebec and made their way to Ontario, to a place called Tutello Heights, where the air smelled of pine and wild grass instead of coal smoke and crowded streets. And something remarkable happened. Alec stopped dying. His lungs cleared. His cough faded. He grew stronger. Whether it was the clean air or just the chaotic mercy of disease choosing to pass him by. Alec Bell survived when his brothers hadn't. He became the carrier of the family's voice, the one who'd pushed their obsession with speech and sound further than any of them had imagined possible, because within months of arriving in the New World, still recovering his strength, still processing the deaths of Edward and Melville, Alec received an offer from Boston University. They wanted him to teach deaf children using his father's visible speech system. Show deaf students these symbols. Teach them to position their mouths and tongues correctly, and they could speak clearly, even though they'd never heard speech. It was revolutionary pedagogy, and it paid an actual salary. Alec Bell moved to Boston in April 1871, barely a year after coughing blood across the Atlantic, and found himself in a city that was already alive with electricity. Telegraph wires connected every major building, clicking their dot-dash Morse code at 120 words per minute. Messages that would have taken weeks by horseback now took minutes by wire. It was magic made routine, human thoughts traveling as electrical pulses through copper, translated back into words at the other end. Everyone thought this was as fast as communication could possibly be. The telegraph was the ultimate achievement, the final victory over distance. But Bell saw something everyone else missed. These copper wires were prisoners, he thought, forced to carry only dots and dashes when they could carry so much more. Sound was vibration. Electricity was current. If a tuning fork's vibration could create electrical current, and it could, Bell tested this himself, then that current traveling through wire could make another tuning fork vibrate at the other end. Sound could teleport. Not representations of sound, not code standing in for sound, but actual sound itself, riding electricity like a river. His first laboratory was a rented attic room in Boston, reached by stairs that creaked like musical instruments. He taught deaf children during the day, beautiful, silent children learning to shape their mouths around sounds they'd never heard, and worked through the night chasing electrical ghosts. One of his students was 5-year-old George Sanders, a bright boy who'd lost his hearing to scarlet fever. George's father, Thomas, owned a profitable leather business and offered Bell room and board in exchange for teaching his son. Thomas Sanders had no idea he was funding the experiment that would make his entire business model obsolete by enabling instant orders from anywhere in the country. Bell worked with tuning forks first. Simple experiments. Strike a fork, hold it near a coil of wire wrapped around an iron bar, watch the electricity flow. Ground rules of physics. Vibration creates electrical current. Current travels through wire. Current creates magnetic fields that cause vibration at the other end. But tuning forks only made single notes, and human speech was infinitely more complex. Dozens of frequencies happening simultaneously, changing every fraction of a second as lips and tongues danced through words. The breakthrough came from failure, as breakthroughs often do. Bell was trying to build a harmonic telegraph, a device that could send multiple Morse code messages simultaneously by using different frequencies for each message. Telegraph companies would pay fortunes for this, because every wire could carry only one message at a time, creating bottlenecks during business hours. If you could send 8 messages at once using 8 different musical tones, you'd multiply capacity without stringing new wires. Bell's harmonic telegraph kept failing in interesting ways. The signals would bleed together, different frequencies mixing and interfering, creating muddled noise instead of clear separation. Every other inventor would have seen this as a problem to solve. Bell heard it as something else entirely. If multiple frequencies could travel together through a wire, if they could mix and interfere and arrive at the other end as combined vibration, then the infinite complexity of a human voice could travel too. Every voice was just a unique combination of frequencies after all. The fundamental tone of the vocal cords plus all the harmonics added by the shape of the mouth and throat. If his harmonic telegraph was accidentally mixing frequencies, then accidentally, almost by mistake, Bell had built the beginning of a telephone. He needed help. The theory was clear in his mind, but building the actual devices required skills Bell didn't possess. Metalwork, precise machining, the ability to look at a rough sketch and understand what it meant in 3 dimensions. Fortunately, Boston was full of brilliant craftsmen who could build anything for the right price. Thomas Watson was 20 years old when he met Alexander Graham Bell in 1874. Watson worked at Charles Williams's shop, the best electrical workshop in Boston, making telegraph equipment and experimental devices for inventors who haunted the place with wild ideas and empty pockets. Bell came in with sketches of his harmonic telegraph, explaining what he needed with such enthusiasm that Watson agreed to work with him despite Bell having almost no money. They were nearly the same age, Bell just 27, both driven by something beyond profit, the pure intoxication of making new things exist. They worked like men possessed. Bell would teach all day, then arrive at Watson's workshop after dinner and work until 3 or 4 in the morning, surviving on tea and bread and the electric thrill of discovery. Watson would build what Bell imagined, testing and adjusting, breaking and rebuilding. They filled notebooks with diagrams and observations, tracking every tiny variation in their experiments. Most nights they failed. Devices that should have worked stayed silent. Signals that traveled perfectly one day disappeared the next. But slowly, through hundreds of attempts, they began to understand the strange physics of electrical sound transmission. And in the back of Bell's mind, always, was the memory of his mother's silence. His brother's deaths, the weight of being the survivor. He was teaching deaf children to speak, while simultaneously trying to make machines speak across distances. His whole life had become about voice and silence, sound and deafness, the desperate human need to communicate across whatever barriers existence placed between one consciousness and another. The telephone wasn't just an invention for Bell, it was personal. It was everything. By 1875, Bell's life had split into two worlds that rarely touched. During daylight hours, he was Professor Bell, teaching at Boston University's School of Oratory, working with deaf students who watched his face with desperate attention as he shaped sounds they'd never heard. He'd demonstrate visible speech symbols, showing them exactly where to place their tongues, how to open their throats, which muscles to tighten, to create the difference between P and B. Between S and Z, some of his students would never speak clearly. Their deafness was too profound, their neural pathways too different. But others would learn to produce words so precise that strangers didn't realize they were deaf until conversation revealed they couldn't hear. Responses. Among these students was Mabel Hubbard, 15 years old when Bell met her. Deaf since she was 5, when scarlet fever stole her hearing so completely that she couldn't even hear herself scream. But Mabel had learned to read lips with such precision that she could follow normal conversation, her eyes tracking speakers' mouths so quickly that she seemed to hear through vision alone. She was brilliant, curious, the daughter of Gardner Green Hubbard, a wealthy patent lawyer and entrepreneur who'd made fortunes in transportation and communication. Hubbard saw immediately what Bell was attempting with his electrical experiments, and more importantly, he saw that Bell had no money, no business sense, and no political connections, all things Hubbard possessed in abundance. It was a perfect arrangement, almost too perfect. Hubbard would fund Bell's experiments. His law firm would handle patents. His connections would open doors to investors and manufacturers. In exchange, Bell would give Hubbard partial ownership of whatever he invented. And there was something else, unspoken, but hovering over every meeting. Mabel. Bell was falling in love with his student, this young woman who moved through silence like a swimmer through deep water. And Hubbard knew it, encouraged it even, because what better way to bind a genius to your family than through marriage? But at night, Bell's other world opened. He'd climb the stairs to his attic laboratory, light the gas lamps, and become someone else entirely, an electrical sorcerer chasing something that most educated people thought was impossible. The physics were clear enough. Sound was vibration. Electricity could carry vibration's pattern. Another device could translate that pattern back into sound. Clear in theory, maddeningly difficult in practice. Every material behaved differently. Temperature changed everything. Humidity affected results. Some nights the devices worked perfectly. Other nights, using identical equipment in identical conditions, nothing. Thomas Watson would arrive after finishing his paying work at William's shop, and they'd begin again. They tried dozens of designs for transmitters, devices to convert sound into electrical current. Tuning fork designs, membrane designs, spring designs. Bell had discovered that if you talked near a stretched membrane, the sound vibrations moved the membrane. And if you attached that membrane to a piece of metal moving near a magnet, you could create tiny electrical currents that matched the sound's pattern. But the currents were so weak they barely traveled 10 feet through wire before dying into electrical noise. They tried different wire thicknesses, different magnets, different membrane materials, rubber, paper, animal skin. They built receivers, devices to convert the electrical current back into sound, using electromagnets to vibrate iron diaphragms. Sometimes they'd hear faint noises through the receiver, ghostly suggestions of sound, but never clear speech, never anything you could call communication. Just electrical whispers, tantalizing hints that they were close to something revolutionary. And every week, Bell grew more aware that he was racing against time and competitors he couldn't even see. In workshops and laboratories across America and Europe, other inventors were chasing the same dream. Some were brilliant scientists with university backing. Others were self-taught tinkerers working in basements. A few were charlatans claiming breakthroughs they hadn't achieved, trying to attract investment. Bell heard rumors constantly. Someone in New York had transmitted clear speech. Someone in Chicago had built a working telephone. Someone in Germany had filed a patent. Most rumors were false, but some weren't. The most dangerous competitor was Elisha Gray. a self-made farm boy from Ohio who taught himself electricity and built Western Electric Manufacturing Company into a telegraph powerhouse. Gray was everything Bell wasn't: a practical businessman, an experienced manufacturer, a man with teams of engineers and machine shops and testing facilities. Gray had been working on acoustic telegraphy, using sound tones for telegraphy, for years. He understood electromagnetic induction, resonance, frequency separation. He had more money, better equipment, and the backing of Western Union Telegraph Company, which controlled 90% of America's telegraph business, with $41 million in assets. Bell had Watson, Hubbard's limited funding, a rented attic, and an obsession that cost him his health. He developed crushing headaches that lasted for days. He'd work 20-hour stretches and collapse into sleep so deep that Watson couldn't wake him. He stopped eating properly, living on tea and crackers, his body thinning until his clothes hung loose. His father begged him to rest. Mabel worried he'd work himself to death like his brothers. But Bell couldn't stop, because stopping meant Gray would win, meant all those nights of failure would stay failures forever, meant the vision of voices traveling through wires would remain imagination instead of becoming reality. Through the winter of 1875, Bell and Watson achieved their first genuine breakthrough. They were testing the harmonic telegraph, still trying to make that commercially viable to fund the telephone work, when one of the transmitter reeds stopped working. It had become stuck against its electromagnet. Watson was in the transmitter room trying to free it when he plucked the stuck reed to loosen it. The reed vibrated. Bell, in the receiver room with his ear pressed against the device, heard something extraordinary, not a pure musical tone, but a complex sound, a twang, something that carried harmonics and overtones, something that sounded almost organic. Bell came running. "What did you do?" he demanded. "Do it again!" Watson plucked the reed again. Bell heard it again through the receiver, a sound with texture, with complexity, with character. This wasn't dots and dashes. This was real sound, or close enough to prove the principle worked. The electrical current created by the vibrating reed, weak as it was, had traveled through the wire and reproduced a similar vibration at the other end. Not clearly enough for speech yet, but the physics were proven. Sound could teleport. They worked with renewed fury, knowing they were close, knowing that somewhere Gray was equally close. Bell designed a new transmitter based on his visible speech understanding of how voices worked. Different sounds had different patterns. Vowels were pure tones with harmonics. Consonants were noises and clicks. Speech was both combined in rapid sequence. To transmit all of this, he needed something that could respond to all frequencies simultaneously, not just single tones like tuning fork designs. He sketched a design using a membrane attached to a reed, touching a pool of liquid, usually acidulated water with battery acid. As sound moved the membrane, the reed would move deeper or shallower in the liquid, changing electrical resistance, creating varying current that matched the sound wave's pattern. It was dangerous work. Battery acid burned skin. Spills ruined equipment. The liquid transmitter was finicky, requiring constant adjustment. But it produced stronger currents than previous designs, and Watson's receivers were getting more sensitive. They could hear tones clearly now through the receiver, pure notes from tuning forks, simple tunes hummed near the transmitter. But speech remained unclear, garbled, a mess of syllables that might have been words or might have been wishful thinking. Meanwhile, Bell's financial situation grew desperate. Teaching income barely covered living expenses. Hubbard was losing patience, wanting results or wanting to stop funding experiments. Other investors that Hubbard had approached wanted proof the telephone could work before risking money. And patent lawyers, Hubbard's own firm included, kept pressing Bell to file patent applications, even for the incomplete designs, just to establish dates and claim priority. The problem was that filing patents cost money. Bell didn't have and revealed designs that competitors could steal or work around. The other problem was that Bell himself didn't fully understand what he was building. He could make parts of the telephone work, but not reliably, not predictably. Some days the liquid transmitter produced clear tones. Other days it produced nothing but buzzing noise. He needed more time for testing, for understanding the physics, for refining the designs. But time was running out. By late 1875, Hubbard was insisting they file patent applications immediately, and rumors about Gray's progress were growing more specific and more alarming. On January 12, 1876, Bell filed his first complete telephone patent application. It described multiple methods for electrical speech transmission, including the liquid transmitter design he'd been developing. The patent drawings showed membrane transmitters, variable resistance systems, and receiver designs. The language was deliberately broad, trying to claim the entire concept of electrical voice transmission, regardless of specific mechanism. Bell's application was thorough, technical, and covered by Hubbard's law firm fees. But Bell knew it wasn't finished. The devices described in the patent didn't work reliably yet. He was patenting theory more than practice, claiming invention of something he'd achieved only partially. This bothered him. His Scottish Presbyterian upbringing made half-truths feel like lies. But Hubbard insisted that patents establish priority, not perfection. File now, prove it works later. Worry about lawsuits when you're rich enough to afford them. What Bell didn't know was that in Chicago, Elisha Gray was having the exact same conversation with his lawyers. Gray had been experimenting with voice transmission for months. He'd built similar membrane transmitters. He'd tested liquid resistance designs. He'd heard speech-like sounds through his receivers. But like Bell, Gray's devices worked only inconsistently. Gray wanted to wait to perfect the invention before filing. His lawyers argued otherwise. File a patent caveat, a document announcing intention to file a full patent just to establish the date and claim priority. The caveat would cost less, require less detail, and reserve Gray's right to file the complete patent within 3 months. So on February 14th, 1876, Valentine's Day, the universe played its cosmic joke. In Washington, D.C., at the United States Patent Office, 2 documents arrived describing methods for electrical transmission of speech. Gardner Hubbard filed Bell's complete patent application at noon exactly. 300 miles away in Chicago, Elisha Gray was still having his caveat document prepared for filing. Gray's lawyer wouldn't reach the Washington Patent Office until 2 hours later, at 2 in the afternoon. Those 120 minutes changed everything. The patent system worked by date and time of filing. First to file wins, second place gets nothing. Patent examiners would later note that Bell's application and Gray's caveat described remarkably similar liquid transmitter designs, suggesting independent parallel discovery. They'd note that Bell's application was more complete and comprehensive. They'd note that Gray's caveat contained detailed descriptions of principles Bell's patent only mentioned generally. Legal scholars would argue for a century about who really invented the telephone first. But the Patent Office didn't care about philosophical questions of invention. They cared about dates, times, signatures, and fees. Patent application number 174,465 was filed by Alexander Graham Bell on February 14, 1876, at noon. Elisha Gray's caveat was filed the same day at 2 p.m. Bell was first. Gray was second. In the race that would determine who owned the future of human communication, Gray had lost by the time it takes to eat lunch. The patent was granted on March 7th, 1876, Bell's 29th birthday. It would become the most legally valuable patent ever issued, eventually worth more than $100 billion in litigation and licensing and corporate value. But on March 7th, Bell was just relieved and exhausted and aware that owning a patent meant nothing if he couldn't make the invention actually work reliably. Which brings us to March 10th, 1876, a Friday afternoon in Boston. Bell was in his laboratory, no longer just an attic. Hubbard had rented him better space after the patent was secured, working on the liquid transmitter design. The device sat on a table, a membrane stretched tight with a thin reed attached. The reed's tip suspended in a cup of acidulated water connected to a battery, and wires leading to Watson's room down the hall where the receiver was set up. Bell was adjusting the acid concentration, adding more battery acid to the water mixture to increase conductivity. The acid was dangerous stuff, sulfuric acid that burned organic material on contact. Bell worked carefully, using a glass rod to stir, adding drops from a bottle. But his hands were tired from hours of work, his attention split between the mixture and his notes, and his grip slipped. The bottle tipped, acid splashed onto the table. Drops hit his clothes. He felt immediate burning as the acid began eating through fabric toward his skin. In pain and panic, without thinking about patents or inventions or history, Bell called out words that would become the most famous first telephone sentence ever spoken. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Down the hall, in a room with the door closed, Thomas Watson was sitting at a table with the receiver pressed against his ear, listening for test signals. He'd been sitting there for hours, listening to silence and occasional clicks and buzzes, the usual nothing of their usual experiments. But this time he heard something different. Not distinct words at first, just voice-like sounds, human tones, something that sounded impossibly like speech coming through the receiver. He listened harder, pressing the device against his ear until it hurt. The sounds resolved into words. Bell's voice, asking him to come. Watson understood three things simultaneously. The telephone had just worked, Bell needed help, and they'd accidentally created history while Bell was getting acid burns. Watson ran down the hallway and burst into Bell's laboratory to find Bell frantically wiping acid from his clothes and skin. "I heard you!" Watson shouted. "I heard every word clearly!" They stared at each other, pain and triumph mixing into something beyond words. Then they switched places. Watson spoke into the transmitter. Bell listened through the receiver. And there it was, Watson's voice, traveling through copper wire as easily as light through glass, arriving at Bell's ear as recognizable speech. Not perfect speech, tinny and faint, but undeniably, unmistakably human voice. They spent the next hour running between rooms like madmen, taking turns speaking and listening, testing words and sentences and songs, laughing and shouting, and sometimes just sitting in silence, trying to comprehend what they'd done. Distance had just become negotiable. The telephone had murdered space. The telephone worked. On that March afternoon in 1876, Bell and Watson had proven that human voices could travel through electrical wires and arrive at the other end as intelligible speech. But working once, by accident, while adjusting acid concentrations was very different from working reliably, repeatedly, in front of witnesses who'd call you a fraud if they suspected trickery. Bell knew this, Watson knew this, and every competitor racing toward the same goal knew that patents without working demonstrations were just expensive paper. The liquid transmitter that had succeeded was also dangerous, unstable, and completely impractical for any real-world use. It required constant adjustment. The acid concentration changed as water evaporated. Temperature affected resistance. The membrane had to be stretched to exact tension. The reed had to touch the liquid surface at precisely the right depth. Too shallow and current was too weak, too deep, and the resistance overwhelmed the signal. Moving the device even slightly threw off the calibration. And, of course, sulfuric acid burned skin, ruined clothes, corroded metal, and released toxic fumes. No one was going to install battery acid telephones in their homes. Bell spent the next weeks in his laboratory trying to make the device more reliable, while simultaneously trying to understand why it worked at all. The physics were stranger than he'd initially realized. The varying resistance, as the reed moved in and out of the liquid, should have created current changes, yes. But those changes were tiny, millionths of an ampere, and they had to travel through yards of wire that had its own resistance. The fact that Watson had heard clear speech through the receiver suggested something else was happening. Some electromagnetic induction effect Bell didn't fully understand. But understanding could come later. First, he needed to prove this wasn't a fluke. On March 15th, 1876, 5 days after the acid spill breakthrough, Bell arranged the first formal demonstration of telephone speech transmission. He invited a small group: Hubbard Thomas Sanders, who'd been funding the experiments, a few trusted colleagues. Bell spoke into the transmitter in one room, while Watson and the witnesses gathered in another room 30 feet away listening to the receiver. Bell recited poetry, sang songs, spoke sentences clearly and slowly. The group heard voice-like sounds, definitely human, possibly words, but not clearly enough to transcribe what Bell was saying without already knowing the words. It was promising but not convincing. The problem was signal strength. Bell's voice moved the membrane, which moved the reed, which changed resistance in the circuit, but these changes created such weak currents that they barely survived the journey through wire. Bell needed a better transmitter design, something that would create stronger signals without requiring dangerous liquids. He went back to his earlier electromagnetic induction designs, membrane attached to an iron armature moving near a magnet, creating current through induction rather than variable resistance. These produced even weaker signals than the liquid design, but they were safer and more stable. Watson attacked the receiver problem from the other end. If they couldn't make the transmitter stronger, maybe they could make the receiver more sensitive. He built receivers with thinner diaphragms that responded to weaker magnetic fields. He experimented with different iron compositions, different magnet strengths, different coil winding patterns. Some designs were more sensitive but picked up every electrical interference from telegraph lines and electric motors. Others were selective but too quiet to hear clearly. Finding the balance required hundreds of tests, endless tiny adjustments. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Elisha Gray was conducting his own frantic experiments. Gray had learned that Bell had filed a patent just hours before Gray's caveat, and Gray's lawyers were analyzing both documents looking for differences they could exploit. Gray's caveat had described using liquid resistance for voice transmission in detail that Bell's patent only mentioned generally, suggesting Gray might have actually built and tested such a device first. But patents weren't granted for being first to invent, they were granted for being first to file. Gray's only hope was to prove Bell's patent was fraudulent or incomplete, or to invent around it with designs different enough to avoid infringement. Gray built liquid transmitters similar to what his caveat described. He built membrane transmitters with variable resistance elements. He experimented with materials Bell hadn't mentioned, mercury instead of acid, metallic powders, graphite suspensions. And Gray had advantages Bell lacked. Professional machine shops, teams of skilled workers, essentially unlimited funding from Western Electric, and no teaching duties stealing his time. Gray could focus entirely on making the telephone practical and commercial, while Bell was still teaching deaf students every morning. The race intensified through spring 1876. Both men knew about each other's work through the invisible network of gossip that connected inventors, patent lawyers, and telegraph operators. Both knew the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition was opening in May, a massive international fair celebrating America's first 100 years, showcasing inventions and innovations from around the world. 10 million visitors would attend over 6 months. Every major scientist, industrialist, and dignitary would be there. It was the perfect stage for demonstrating a revolutionary invention. It was also the perfect place for a competitor to unveil their version first and claim priority in the court of public opinion, regardless of what patent documents said. Bell couldn't afford to attend the exhibition. He had no money for travel or for building an exhibition booth. He had teaching obligations that ran through June, and his telephone still worked only inconsistently, some days producing clear speech, other days barely transmitting recognizable sounds. Hubbard and Sanders pushed him to go anyway, arguing that presence at the Centennial was essential, but Bell resisted. He'd spent his whole life watching his father promote inventions and ideas, and he knew the difference between genuine achievement and mere showmanship. He wouldn't demonstrate something half-finished, but in early June, Bell received a letter that changed his calculation. Sir William Thomson, later known as Lord Kelvin, would be attending the Centennial as part of a group of distinguished judges evaluating scientific and technical exhibits. Thomson was arguably the most respected physicist in the world, The man who'd formulated the laws of thermodynamics, laid the first transatlantic telegraph cable, and calculated the age of the Earth through physics. If Thomson examined Bell's telephone and declared it genuine, no competitor could match that endorsement. Bell borrowed money for train tickets and boarded a night train to Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition opened on May 10th, 1876, covering 285 acres with more than 200 buildings, showcasing inventions, machinery, art and culture from 50 countries. There were colossal steam engines, experimental electric lights, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone booth tucked into a corner of the Massachusetts Education Exhibit, and 10,000 other innovations competing for attention. Bell's display was tiny, a simple table with a transmitter, some wire leading across the building, and a receiver. No fancy booth, no promotional materials, just the device itself and Bell's enthusiasm. For 3 weeks, almost no one noticed Bell's exhibit. Visitors walked past, heading toward the giant Corliss steam engine that powered the entire machinery hall, or toward Thomas Edison's electric pen, or toward the Remington typewriter demonstration. Judges examined hundreds of exhibits before they'd work their way to Bell's obscure corner. Bell waited, demonstrated his telephone to occasional curious visitors, and watched as the days passed with no official recognition. Then on June 25, 1876, Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil wandered into the education section, exhausted, after judging exhibits for hours in 95-degree heat. Dom Pedro was a remarkable man, a Brazilian emperor who spoke 12 languages, corresponded with scientists, and funded education and infrastructure across his country. He was also genuinely curious about technology rather than just pretending for political purposes. And earlier that spring, he'd visited the Boston school where Bell taught, watching Bell work with deaf students using visible speech. Impressed by the technique and the teacher, Dom Pedro recognized Bell in the obscure corner booth and stopped to greet him warmly, asking what he was demonstrating. Bell explained the telephone, that voices could travel through electrical wires and be heard miles away. Dom Pedro looked skeptical but polite. Bell asked the emperor to hold the receiver, a crude device you pressed against your ear, while Bell walked to the far end of the building with the transmitter. 200 feet away, Bell positioned himself at the transmitter and began reciting Hamlet's soliloquy. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, he spoke clearly, projecting as he'd learned from his grandfather's theatrical training, his voice vibrating the membrane, the armature moving near the magnet. Tiny currents flowing through 200 feet of wire to the receiver pressed against Dom Pedro's ear, and Dom Pedro heard it. Not perfectly, the voice was tinny, faint, strange, but unmistakably Bell's voice, speaking Shakespeare from 200 feet away without shouting, without speaking tubes, without any visible connection except this thin wire. The emperor literally jumped from his chair, shouting in Portuguese, "Meu Deus, ele fala!" My God, it talks. He grabbed the receiver and listened more intently, while Bell continued speaking. Then he started laughing and calling other judges over, insisting they listen to this impossible device. Within minutes, every important person in the hall surrounded Bell's booth. Sir William Thomson took the receiver and listened while Bell spoke from across the building. Thomson, who'd helped lay telegraph cables across the Atlantic Ocean, who understood electrical transmission as well as anyone alive, heard Bell's voice traveling through wire as actual sound rather than coded pulses. He stood there listening, his face showing a scientist recognizing something genuinely new, then declared to everyone present, "This is the most wonderful thing I have seen in America." Other judges took turns listening, French scientists, German engineers, Brazilian dignitaries, American industrialists. Bell spoke poetry, sang songs, held normal conversations where listeners could respond by shouting back, and Bell could hear them through the receiver when he switched positions. The crowd grew. Journalists arrived, smelling a story. By evening, Alexander Graham Bell had gone from unknown teacher to the man who'd conquered sound. and his tiny corner booth had become the centennial's most talked-about exhibit. The newspapers the next day called it a marvel, a wonder, a miracle of science. The New York Tribune wrote that Professor Bell's speaking and singing telephone is the greatest marvel hitherto achieved by the electric telegraph. The Philadelphia Press called it perhaps the greatest wonder of the centennial. Scientists who'd ignored Bell's booth days earlier now lined up to examine the device, to test it themselves, to understand how it worked. And in Chicago, Elisha Gray read these newspaper accounts and realized he'd lost the race in the most public way possible. But winning attention and winning markets are different achievements. Bell returned to Boston with newspaper clippings and testimonials, but no money, no manufacturing capability, and devices that still worked unreliably. The liquid transmitter that had impressed Dom Pedro required constant adjustment and couldn't be manufactured safely. The electromagnetic induction transmitters were safer, but produced signals so weak they barely traveled across a room. Bell needed better designs, more funding, and time to refine the technology before it could become practical. His personal life was also demanding attention. Mabel Hubbard had agreed to marry him, or rather, her father had agreed that she could marry him once Bell could support a family, which meant once the telephone started generating income. Bell was 29 years old, internationally famous after the centennial, holding the world's most valuable patent and too poor to afford his own apartment. He lived with the Sanders family, worked in borrowed laboratory space, and depended on Hubbard's continued funding for food and materials. The solution came from an unexpected direction. Western Union Telegraph Company, the communications monopoly that dominated American telegraphy with 10,000 miles of wire and annual revenue over $40 million, offered to buy Bell's telephone patents for $100,000. For Bell personally, this was an impossible fortune, more money than he'd see in a lifetime of teaching. For Hubbard and Sanders, it represented recovering their investment with good profit. For Watson, it meant job security. Everyone should have accepted immediately, but something made Hubbard hesitate. The telephone patent wasn't just valuable, it was potentially transformative in ways Western Union might not fully appreciate. The telegraph was fundamentally limited. Only trained operators could use it. Messages had to be coded and decoded. Transmission was asynchronous, and the emotional context of human voice was completely lost. The telephone offered real-time conversation, usable by anyone, carrying all the nuance of voice and emotion. If the technical problems could be solved, the telephone wouldn't just compete with telegraphy, it would make telegraphy obsolete for most communication. Hubbard proposed a counteroffer. Bell, Hubbard, Sanders, and Watson would form the Bell Telephone Company, retain the patents, and license or sell telephone equipment themselves. Western Union could become their partner or their competitor, but the patents would remain under Bell's control. It was an audacious gamble, betting that four men with almost no capital could build a business against the most powerful communications company in America. Western Union's leadership laughed at the counteroffer and walked away. Their internal memo, later made public, called the telephone an interesting toy with no commercial value. The memo argued that voices traveling through wires was a parlor trick, that businesses needed written records of communications, that the telephone's dependence on both parties being available simultaneously made it impractical, and that in any case, Western Union's existing telegraph infrastructure gave them insurmountable advantage if voice transmission ever did become commercially viable. So in July 1876, the Bell Telephone Company was founded with exactly $5,000 in capital, roughly $150,000 in today's money, to compete against a $40 million monopoly. The company's assets consisted of Bell's patents, Watson's technical skills, Hubbard's legal and business connections, Sanders' modest funding, and an invention that worked inconsistently and couldn't yet be manufactured reliably. Every sane business calculation said they would fail within months, But they had one advantage. Western Union didn't. They understood what the telephone really was. Western Union saw it as a telegraph improvement, a way to send voice instead of code through existing infrastructure. Bell and his partners saw it as something entirely different, a completely new form of human connection, transforming communication from asynchronous messages to synchronous conversation, from formal business exchange to intimate personal contact. The telephone wasn't better telegraphy. It was the death of distance itself, the creation of a world where every human could speak directly to every other human, regardless of miles between them. Bell spent the summer of 1876 demonstrating the telephone to anyone who'd watch, slowly improving reliability, slowly building credibility. He connected telephone lines between buildings in Boston, letting audiences hear voices traveling through wire. He used telegraph lines, borrowed from telegraph companies, temporarily converting them to telephone use to demonstrate long-distance potential. He published technical papers explaining the physics of electromagnetic voice transmission. And gradually, despite continued skepticism, orders began arriving for telephone equipment. The first commercial telephone line was installed in April 1877. Connecting the office of Charles Williams, Watson's former employer and now telephone equipment manufacturer, with his home in Somerville, Massachusetts. Williams' wife could call the office to ask when he'd be home for dinner. His children could say goodnight to their father if he worked late. It was intimate, personal, completely unnecessary by any business metric, and absolutely revolutionary. The family home had just become connected to the world beyond its walls in ways that had never been possible before. On July 11th, 1877, Alexander Graham Bell married Mabel Hubbard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She was 19 years old, deaf, brilliant, and about to become the wife of a man who would spend the next decade either traveling the world promoting his invention or locked in courtrooms defending it. For a honeymoon, they sailed to England, where Bell would demonstrate the telephone to British scientists and try to establish European patents and markets. Mabel read lips so perfectly that during their honeymoon, Bell sometimes forgot she was deaf until someone spoke from behind her and she didn't respond. While Bell was honeymooning in England, Western Union changed its mind. The company that had called the telephone a toy was now watching telephone installations multiply across New England. They were receiving reports about conversations traveling through wires clearly enough for business use. They were seeing newspaper articles about Bell's European demonstrations, and they were realizing their internal memo had been catastrophically wrong. So Western Union did what monopolies do when they've missed an opportunity. They decided to steal it. They hired Thomas Edison, America's most famous inventor, to design an improved telephone transmitter that would avoid infringing Bell's patents. They hired Elijah Gray as a consultant. They created the American-speaking telephone company in October 1877 and simply started installing telephones in direct competition with Bell, claiming their designs were different enough to avoid patent infringement. Western Union had $41 million in capital, 10,000 miles of wire already installed, and a legal team larger than Bell's entire company. The war for the telephone's future had begun, and one side had brought cannons to fight someone carrying a patent certificate. The war between Bell and Western Union was never going to be fair. On one side stood a telecommunications empire with more capital than most small countries, controlling 90% of America's telegraph business, owning thousands of miles of wire already connecting every major city, and employing the era's most famous inventor to improve their telephone designs. On the other side stood a startup company with $5,000, a brilliant but impractical inventor who'd rather teach deaf children than manage a business, and a device that still worked inconsistently enough that demonstrations sometimes failed, embarrassingly. Thomas Edison's contribution to Western Union's telephone effort was characteristically ingenious. Bell's transmitters used electromagnetic induction, sound vibrating, a membrane moved an iron armature near a magnet, creating tiny electrical currents. Edison's design used carbon granules compressed between metal plates. When sound vibrated the membrane, it changed the pressure on the carbon granules, which changed their electrical resistance dramatically. The varying resistance in the circuit created much stronger currents than Bell's induction designs, meaning Edison's transmitter could send voice signals farther with greater clarity. Edison filed his carbon transmitter patent in April 1877, and Western Union began manufacturing telephones using Edison's transmitter paired with Bell-style receivers. Claiming this combination didn't infringe Bell's patents since the transmitter design was completely different. It was technically correct. Edison's carbon transmitter was indeed different from Bell's designs, but philosophically dishonest, since the entire concept of electrical voice transmission was what Bell had pioneered and patented. Bell's company faced an existential crisis. Western Union was installing telephones faster than Bell could, charging lower prices because their existing telegraph infrastructure meant they didn't need to string new wires, and offering objectively better performance because Edison's transmitter really did work better than Bell's. Within months, Western Union had thousands of telephone installations across major cities. The Bell Telephone Company was being outcompeted in the market for its own invention. The only weapon Bell had was his patent, and patents are only valuable if you can enforce them in court. So in September 1878, the Bell Telephone Company sued Western Union for patent infringement in what would become one of the most important legal battles in American business history. Bell's lawyers argued that patent number 174,465 covered the fundamental principle of electrical voice transmission, regardless of specific transmitter design, meaning any working telephone infringed Bell's patent. Western Union's lawyers argued the opposite, that Bell's patent covered only the specific designs Bell had described, that Edison's carbon transmitter was a separate invention, and that Western Union had every right to build telephones using non-infringing components. The lawsuit would take nearly a year to resolve, and during that year, both companies fought for survival in the marketplace while bleeding money on legal fees. Bell personally had to testify for days, explaining the physics of his invention to judges and lawyers who barely understood electricity. He had to demonstrate his telephones in courtrooms, praying they'd work properly. He had to watch lawyers dissect every word of his patent application, looking for ambiguities they could exploit. And he had to endure Western Union's lawyers suggesting he'd stolen ideas from Elisha Gray, from Edison, from various other inventors, that his patent was fraudulent, that he wasn't even the real inventor. Meanwhile, the telephone itself was slowly, stubbornly becoming practical. Watson and a small team of craftsmen were manufacturing improved transmitters and receivers in Charles Williams' Boston workshop, slowly refining designs based on feedback from users. The early telephones were crude instruments. You had to press the receiver painfully hard against your ear, shout directly into the transmitter, and hope no electrical interference disrupted the signal. But they worked well enough for businesses that needed to coordinate between buildings, for families that wanted to check on distant relatives, for doctors making house calls who could consult with colleagues, for fire departments coordinating emergency responses. The first telephone exchange, a central location where multiple telephone lines connected, allowing any subscriber to call any other subscriber, opened in New Haven, Connecticut in January 1878. It had 21 subscribers initially, mostly businesses and wealthy families. Connecting a call required turning a crank on your telephone to signal the exchange operator, telling the operator who you wanted to reach, and waiting while the operator physically plugged wires into a switchboard to complete the circuit between your line and the destination line. It was slow, required human operators for every call, and represented the most revolutionary communication system since writing was invented. The operators themselves became crucial to making the telephone practical. Initially, telephone companies hired teenage boys as operators, assuming that climbing poles and pulling wires required masculine strength. This was a catastrophic mistake. The teenage boys spent more time pranking callers, listening to private conversations for entertainment, and starting fights with each other over the lines than actually connecting calls efficiently. They deliberately connect wrong numbers, make rude comments to subscribers, and sometimes just ignore calls if they were bored. The solution came from necessity. Fire the boys, hire young women instead. The first female telephone operator was Emma Nutt, hired by the Telephone Dispatch Company in Boston on September 1st, 1878, along with her sister Stella. The companies discovered that young women had the patience to handle difficult callers, the pleasant voices that reassured subscribers, the finger dexterity for rapid switchboard work, and the social training that made rudeness to customers unthinkable. Emma Nutt worked as an operator for 33 years and memorized every number in the New England telephone directory, thousands of numbers, names, addresses, becoming the human intelligence that made the system work. These operators, later called Hello Girls, became the invisible architects of the telephone network. They worked 12-hour shifts, standing at massive switchboards with hundreds of holes and plugs, handling up to 15,000 calls per day in busy exchanges. Their fingers dancing across the board like pianists, completing connections in seconds, memorizing subscriber numbers and preferences, knowing who was friends with whom, who to wake for emergency calls, which businesses closed when. They were the first interactive network nodes, human routers directing the flow of voices through copper pathways. By late 1878, telephone wires had begun creating spiderwebs above city streets. Manhattan alone had tens of thousands of wires strung from building to building on wooden poles that lined every major street. Some poles carried 300 different telephone and telegraph lines, creating masses of wire so dense they blocked sunlight and sang in the wind like deranged orchestras. The wires drooped in summer heat, snapped in winter cold, tangled together during storms, and occasionally broke and fell on pedestrians. Cities began passing ordinances trying to control the wire chaos, but telephone companies kept stringing more lines to meet exploding demand. The Great Blizzard of March, 1888, brought the madness to a crisis. The storm dumped 4 feet of snow on the northeast. Winds reached 70 miles per hour, and the accumulated weight of ice and snow on overhead wires brought down miles of telephone and telegraph lines across every major city. In New York City, entire blocks became impassable as fallen wires crossed streets like demented spiderwebs. Some wirefalls killed pedestrians caught underneath. Buildings collapsed under the weight of broken poles, crashing onto roofs. The storm killed over 400 people, but it also killed the era of overhead wires. After 1888, cities began demanding that telephone companies bury their wires underground, in lead-wrapped cables, running through subway tunnels and dedicated conduits. This was staggeringly expensive, underground. Cables cost over $1,000 per mile compared to roughly $100 per mile for overhead wires, but it was the only solution for cities drowning in copper. The telephone companies, now generating real revenue from tens of thousands of subscribers, somehow found the capital to rewire entire cities underground. By 1890, Manhattan's telephone wires had vanished from sight, hidden beneath streets in miles of lead-sheathed cable, carrying hundreds of conversations simultaneously through the dark. The Bell Western Union lawsuit finally settled in November 1879, with Western Union admitting defeat. The settlement terms were remarkable. Western Union agreed to exit the telephone business entirely, selling their 56,000 telephones and their network infrastructure to Bell for essentially nothing, and acknowledging Bell's patents as valid and enforceable. In exchange, Bell agreed to stay out of the telegraph business and to pay Western Union 20% of telephone rental revenue for the life of Bell's patents. It seemed like an odd compromise. Western Union was obviously the losing party. paying Bell to take over their telephone operations, but Western Union's leadership had calculated carefully. Bell's patents would expire in 1893 and 1894, just 14 and 15 years away. Western Union would collect 20% of telephone revenue during those years, then would be free to re-enter the telephone market without patent restrictions. They expected telephone service to grow modestly, generate steady, if unspectacular revenue, and eventually become a minor supplement to their core telegraph business. This calculation was spectacularly wrong. The telephone didn't grow modestly, it exploded. By 1880, just 3 years after the first commercial installation, there were 60,000 telephones in America. By 1885, 150,000. By 1890, 250,000. And these numbers understated the growth because each telephone could connect to every other telephone in its exchange, meaning each new telephone made every existing telephone more valuable. It was a network effect that no one had predicted. The telephone was becoming more useful as more people had telephones, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of adoption. The man who understood this best wasn't Alexander Graham Bell. He'd mostly withdrawn from the company's daily operations, pursuing new inventions and fighting lawsuits, but Theodore Vail, a former U.S. Post Office superintendent, whom Hubbard recruited to run Bell Telephone in 1878. Vail saw what everyone else missed. The telephone wasn't just a product, it was infrastructure. Like railroads or water systems, the telephone's value came from universal access and interconnection. A single telephone was worthless. 2 telephones had limited value. But thousands of telephones, all connected, created a nervous system for society itself. Vail's vision drove the company's strategy. Build exchanges in every city. Connect every exchange to every other exchange. License local operators, but maintain control of long-distance lines. Standardize equipment and service quality, and grow the network as fast as capital would allow. It was infrastructure thinking, not product thinking, and it required staggering capital investment. Vail raised millions from investors, issuing stock and bonds, backed only by the promise that universal telephone service would generate revenue forever. Skeptics called it a bubble, a speculative mania based on a toy that would never replace telegrams for serious business. Vail kept building anyway. The engineering challenges of building a national telephone network were extraordinary. Electrical signals weakened as they traveled through wire, a principle called attenuation, meaning long-distance calls required shouting and even then barely transmitted intelligible speech. Bell's early transmitters could send clear voice about 2 miles before the signal degraded into unusable noise. Edison's carbon transmitter improved this to roughly 10 miles. But America was 3,000 miles wide, and Vail wanted every city connected to every other city through direct voice communication. The solution required better transmitters, better receivers, better wire, better switching systems, and technologies that didn't yet exist. Telephone companies began hiring electrical engineers and physicists to solve fundamental problems of signal transmission. They experimented with thicker wire, which carried stronger signals but cost more and weighed more. They tested different wire materials, different insulation methods, different pole spacing. They built amplifier stations along long-distance routes where operators could listen to weak signals and repeat them loudly into new transmitters, creating human signal boosters every 30 miles. By 1885, telephone calls could travel roughly 100 miles with acceptable clarity. This allowed major cities within regional clusters to connect, Boston to New York, Chicago to Milwaukee, but transcontinental communication remained impossible. The signal loss over 1,500 miles was so severe that no amount of shouting could overcome it. Engineers calculated that directly connecting New York to San Francisco would require wire so thick and heavy that poles couldn't support it, or so many amplifier stations that the cumulative distortion would make speech unintelligible. The telephone, miraculous as it was, seemed fundamentally limited to regional communication. Then in 1899, a Serbian immigrant named Michael Pupin invented loading coils while teaching at Columbia University. Pupin understood electromagnetic theory deeply and realized that telephone wires acted as crude antennas, leaking signal energy as electromagnetic radiation. His loading coils were inductors, wire coiled around iron cores, spaced at specific intervals along telephone lines. The coils changed the electrical characteristics of the line, reducing signal loss and distortion dramatically. Suddenly, voices could travel 1,500 miles clearly instead of 30 miles faintly. The mathematics of why loading coils worked was complex, involving differential equations, describing wave propagation in transmission lines, but the practical effect was revolutionary. The American Telephone and Telegraph Company, Bell's long-distance subsidiary, immediately began installing Pupin coils on major routes. The New York to Chicago line, which had required 4 amplifier stations with operators repeating every conversation, now carried clear calls with no amplification. The cost savings were enormous, but more importantly, transcontinental telephony suddenly shifted from theoretically impossible to merely extremely difficult. The first transcontinental telephone call happened on January 25, 1915, 39 years after Bell's first telephone sentence. Alexander Graham Bell sat in a laboratory in New York City, while Thomas Watson sat in a laboratory in San Francisco, 3,400 miles away. Between them ran telephone wires supported by 130,000 poles, using 5,000 tons of copper, incorporating thousands of Pupin loading coils, crossing mountains and deserts and the Great Plains. The cost of building this line exceeded $1 million, roughly $30 million in today's money, just to prove that voices could span a continent. At 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, the circuit went live. Bell, now 67 years old, white-bearded and famous, picked up the telephone and spoke the words he'd shouted 40 years earlier in pain and panic. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," in San Francisco. Thomas Watson, now 60, heard every word clearly through the receiver. The voice had traveled 3,400 miles in 1/15 of a second, riding electrical signals through copper wire at nearly the speed of light. Watson replied with perfect timing, "It would take me a week to get to you now, Mr. Bell." Both men laughed, old partners sharing a private joke about how their invention had murdered distance. Then they spent the next 20 minutes talking, reminiscing, testing the line's clarity with poetry and songs and conversation, while a room full of dignitaries and journalists witnessed the impossible becoming routine. The telephone call cost $20.70 for the first 3 minutes, roughly $600 in today's money, but it proved that human voices could circle the earth as easily as they could cross a room. The transcontinental line opened for commercial service in 1915, initially available only to the wealthy and to businesses needing urgent cross-country communication. Calling from New York to San Francisco cost over $20 for 3 minutes, more than a week's wages for average workers, but demand exceeded capacity immediately. People would pay any price to hear voices from 3,000 miles away, to speak to family members who'd moved west, to coordinate business across the continent, to experience the technological miracle that Bell had envisioned 40 years earlier. By 1920, the American telephone network connected 13 million telephones, employed hundreds of thousands of operators and technicians, and carried billions of conversations annually. The network's total wire length exceeded 10 million miles, enough to circle the Earth 400 times. The system had become so complex that no single person understood it completely. Engineers specialized in particular aspects: switching systems, transmission lines, operator training, maintenance procedures. The telephone had evolved from a device 2 men could build in an attic to an infrastructure that required armies of specialists to operate and maintain. And through all of this growth, Alexander Graham Bell remained simultaneously famous and miserable. He was internationally celebrated, received medals and honors from dozens of countries, had become wealthy from patent royalties and stock holdings, and had fundamentally changed human civilization. He was also constantly sued, perpetually fighting legal challenges to his patents, exhausted from years of courtroom testimony, and deeply conflicted about what he'd created. Bell developed a passionate hatred for his own invention. The telephone that had made him famous became the mechanism of his torment. It rang constantly at all hours, journalists and inventors and lawyers and cranks all demanding his time. He'd be eating dinner and the telephone would interrupt. He'd be working on new inventions and have to stop for telephone calls. He'd travel to his retreat in Nova Scotia seeking peace, and even there the telephone would find him. He wrote to friends complaining about the beast, his name for the telephone, refusing to have one installed in his study at his Nova Scotia estate. When visitors expressed surprise that the inventor of the telephone didn't use a telephone, Bell would explain with barely controlled anger that he'd invented the device so other people could use it, not so it could torment him. The irony was perfect and painful. He'd built a system designed to eliminate isolation and distance, and it had eliminated his own solitude and peace. His relationship with Mabel became more complicated as his telephone ambivalence deepened. She relied on the telephone's associated technologies, telegraph systems for written messages, eventually teletypes for deaf communication, but she could never experience what Bell had created. The telephone transmitted voice, carried emotional context through tone and inflection and timing, conveyed love and anger and fear through subtle acoustic cues, everything that made human speech intimate and powerful. And Mabel, his wife, the woman he'd married partly because her deafness motivated his voice transmission research, could never hear any of it. His mother had died in 1897 without ever hearing her son's voice through his great invention. The women Bell loved most were imprisoned in silence, while he'd given voices to the world. The telephone network that emerged in the 1880s and 1890s wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a complete reimagining of human geography. For all of history, distance had meant disconnection. If someone you loved traveled 100 miles away, they effectively vanished from your daily life. You could send letters that took days or weeks to arrive. You could send telegrams that cost money and required translation into and out of code. But you couldn't just talk to them, couldn't hear their voice, couldn't share the casual, intimate moments that make relationships real. The telephone changed this absolutely. Geography became negotiable. Distance became a technical problem rather than an existential barrier. Consider what this meant for a family with children who'd moved west for homestead opportunities, leaving elderly parents in Boston or New York. Before the telephone, that separation was nearly absolute. Perhaps a letter every few weeks, maybe a telegram for emergencies, possibly seeing each other once a year if travel was affordable. After the telephone, a parent could call their children weekly, could hear grandchildren's voices, could be part of daily life despite 1,000 miles of separation. The emotional geography of families was being redrawn by copper wire, or consider what it meant for businesses. Before the telephone, conducting commerce required physical presence or written correspondence. If you ran a textile factory in Lowell, Massachusetts, and needed to coordinate with cotton suppliers in Charleston, South Carolina, you sent letters that took a week to arrive, received replies a week later, and hoped nothing changed during the 2 weeks of communication lag. If market conditions shifted, if prices moved, if supplies became scarce, you learned about it too late to respond effectively. The telephone collapsed business time from weeks to minutes. A mill owner could call suppliers directly, negotiate prices in real-time conversation, adjust orders immediately based on current conditions, and coordinate complex operations across hundreds of miles as easily as walking between buildings. The telephone operators who made all this possible became an invisible social infrastructure. By 1890, Major cities had telephone exchanges operating 24 hours a day, with dozens of operators per shift. The operators, nearly all young women now, the teenage boys, having been completely replaced, sat at switchboards that looked like wooden walls, covered with hundreds of holes and dangling cables. Each hole represented a subscriber's line. When someone wanted to make a call, they'd turn a crank on their telephone that sent an electrical signal to the exchange, causing a small flag to drop on the switchboard, showing which subscriber was calling. The operator would plug her headset cable into that subscriber's hole, ask who they wanted to reach, then plug a connection cable between the caller's hole and the destination's hole, completing an electrical circuit that let voices travel between the two telephones. For a brief moment, those two subscribers had a private wire connecting them, a temporary electrical intimacy that the operator created and could destroy by simply unplugging the cables when the call ended. But operators did far more than just plug cables. They memorized thousands of subscriber numbers and names. They knew who was friends with whom, which businesses worked together, which families had regular calling patterns. If you called and said, "Connect me to my doctor," a good operator knew who your doctor was without asking. If you said, "Get me the fire department quickly," the operator completed that connection in seconds, possibly saving lives. If you were traveling and needed to reach someone whose number you didn't know, the operator could often figure out who you meant from context and description. Operators also became informal therapists, confidants, and sometimes matchmakers. They'd listen to regular callers, discuss their lives while waiting for connections. They'd offer condolences when delivering news of deaths or disasters. They'd remember birthdays and anniversaries of frequent callers. They'd notice when elderly subscribers hadn't made calls in several days and would sometimes call to check on them. The technology was impersonal, just electrical signals in copper wire, but the operators made it human. The working conditions for these operators were often brutal. 12-hour shifts were standard, standing the entire time because sitting was considered unprofessional. The switchboards required constant attention and rapid hand movements, leading to chronic arm and back pain. The headsets transmitted not just voices, but also electrical shocks when lightning struck telephone lines during storms, a common occupational hazard that caused hearing damage and occasionally worse injuries. The pay was low, typically $6 to $10 per week in the 1890s, barely enough to live on, and the companies enforced strict codes of conduct. Operators could be fired for rudeness, for being too slow, for listening to private conversations, even though hearing those conversations was unavoidable. Yet thousands of young women competed for operator positions because the alternatives were worse. Factory work was more dangerous and paid similar wages. Domestic service paid slightly better, but meant living in your employer's home under constant supervision. Teaching required education most working-class women couldn't afford. The telephone exchange offered regular hours, relatively clean working conditions, and a kind of respectability that factory work lacked. Operators wore nice clothes to work, used proper grammar, and developed professional skills that could lead to supervisor positions. It was, despite its hardships, one of the better jobs available to women in late 19th century America. The physical infrastructure supporting all these conversations was equally impressive. By 1885, American cities had become forests of telephone poles, each pole supporting dozens or hundreds of wires running in different directions. The poles themselves were typically 30 to 40 feet tall, made of treated wood, and planted deep in the ground for stability. Cross arms at various heights supported the different wire runs, creating the distinctive T-shaped silhouette that dominated urban landscapes. The wires themselves were bare copper, exposed to weather, separated from each other by glass or porcelain insulators that prevented short circuits when wires touched during wind. In cities with many subscribers, the wire tangles became so dense that maintenance workers needed maps just to trace individual circuits. If one wire broke, finding and repairing it required expertise that approached detective work. following wire paths through the tangle, testing connections, climbing poles in all weather to make repairs. Winter was particularly challenging. Ice accumulation on wires could increase their weight 50-fold, causing wires to snap and poles to collapse. Telegraph and telephone companies employed emergency crews who'd work through blizzards trying to restore service. Climbing icy poles in sub-zero temperatures, their fingers going numb while handling frozen metal tools and live electrical wires. The work was dangerous enough that deaths from falls and electrical shocks were routine occupational hazards. The telephone network was built and maintained by people who sometimes died, keeping it running. The Great Blizzard of March, 1888, demonstrated the overhead wire system's fundamental vulnerability. When the storm hit the northeast, it didn't just bring snow and wind. It brought weather so severe that it exposed every weakness in urban infrastructure simultaneously. 4 feet of snow fell in some areas. Winds reached hurricane force. The temperature dropped to 0 Fahrenheit. And the accumulated ice and snow on overhead wires created weights they'd never been designed to support. In New York City alone, over 300 telephone and telegraph poles collapsed, bringing down thousands of miles of wire. The fallen wires created chaotic tangles across streets, making whole blocks impassable. Some wire falls were so severe that buildings collapsed when poles crashed through roofs. Pedestrians caught under falling wires were killed or seriously injured. And because the wires remained connected to electrical and telegraph systems, some fallen wires carried dangerous current, creating invisible hazards in the snow-covered streets. The storm killed over 400 people across the Northeast, but it also killed the assumption that overhead wires were an acceptable long-term solution for urban telecommunications. After 1888, cities began demanding that utilities bury their infrastructure underground. This requirement transformed from reasonable suggestion to absolute mandate as city councils, tired of wire-choked streets and storm-related disasters, passed ordinances prohibiting new overhead wire installation and requiring existing systems to be converted to underground cables within specified timeframes. The engineering challenges of underground cable installation were substantial. Copper wire exposed to soil moisture would corrode rapidly, so cables required protective sheathing, typically lead or steel, wrapped around the copper conductors. Multiple insulated wires could be bundled into single cables, but they had to be carefully separated to prevent electrical interference between circuits. The cables needed to run through protective conduits, ceramic or concrete pipes that prevented damage from excavation and allowed cable replacement without digging up streets. The costs were staggering. A mile of overhead wire on wooden poles might cost $100 to $200 to install. A mile of underground cable in lead sheathing running through dedicated conduit tunnels could cost over $1,000 per mile, 10 times more expensive. For a city like New York with thousands of miles of overhead wire, the conversion to underground cables would require millions of dollars in capital investment at a time when the entire American economy was smaller than a single modern corporation. But the telephone companies, now generating substantial revenue from rapidly growing subscriber bases, somehow raised the capital. They issued bonds backed by future revenue. They increased service fees. They partnered with electric utility companies to share conduit costs. And slowly, block by block, they buried their networks underground. By 1895, Manhattan's telephone wires had almost completely vanished from sight, running instead through miles of dark tunnels beneath the streets, carrying hundreds of thousands of conversations, daily through copper pathways that most New Yorkers never saw and rarely thought about. The underground cables solved the weather vulnerability problem, but created new technical challenges. Underground cables were harder to maintain. You couldn't just climb a pole to fix a break. You had to locate the fault through testing, excavate streets or access tunnel systems, and work in confined spaces that might contain water, rats, and toxic gases from sewers. Cable splicing, Connecting individual wires inside the protective sheathing required specialized skills and tools. A skilled splicer could connect hundreds of wire pairs in a single large cable, ensuring each connection was electrically sound and properly insulated. A process that could take days for major trunk lines. The cables also required periodic maintenance that overhead wires didn't. Lead sheathing eventually corroded or cracked, allowing water infiltration that would short out circuits. The insulation between wire pairs would degrade over years, causing crosstalk where conversations on one circuit bled into other circuits. Temperature changes in underground tunnels would cause cables to expand and contract, sometimes creating tension that pulled connections apart. Telephone companies had to employ armies of cable maintenance workers who spent their careers in dark tunnels beneath cities, keeping the conversation flowing. Meanwhile, the intellectual challenge of connecting every telephone to every other telephone was becoming its own engineering discipline. A small town with 50 telephones could use a simple switchboard, where an operator manually connected any caller to any destination with simple cable plugs. But a city with 10,000 telephones required different solutions. The number of possible connections between 10,000 telephones is roughly 50 million, far too many for manual switching systems to handle efficiently. Telephone engineers developed increasingly sophisticated switching architectures. Large cities got hierarchical systems where local exchanges handled neighborhood connections, while trunk lines connected different exchanges together. If you called someone in your neighborhood, your local operator handled the connection directly. If you called someone across town, your local operator would connect to a trunk line that reached the destination exchange, where a second operator would complete the connection to the destination subscriber. Long-distance calls might pass through 4 or 5 different operators and exchanges, each one adding their piece of the connection path. This hierarchical architecture created interesting effects. Calling your next-door neighbor might require the signal to travel to your local exchange, then back to your neighbor's home, perhaps a mile of wire to connect 2 houses 50 feet apart. Calling across the country required your signal to travel through dozens of exchanges and thousands of miles of wire, with operators at each exchange listening to your request and manually completing their portion of the circuit. The system worked, but it required thousands of operators and introduced delays that made long-distance calling a formal, expensive affair requiring patience and planning. Inventors began working on automatic switching systems that could eliminate human operators entirely. The most successful early design came from Almond Stroger, a Kansas City undertaker who believed that telephone operators were deliberately routing potential customers' calls to his competitor instead of to him. Whether this paranoia was justified didn't matter. It motivated Stroger to invent the automatic telephone exchange in 1889, an electromechanical system where callers could directly dial numbers using pulses that controlled mechanical switches. Stroger's system used rotating selectors, mechanical switches that moved in response to electrical pulses from the telephone to automatically connect calls without operator intervention. A caller would pick up their telephone and rotate a dial, creating a series of electrical pulses corresponding to each digit of the destination number. The exchange equipment would count these pulses and use them to progressively step through mechanical switches until the connection was complete. The system was ingenious, reliable, and completely eliminated the human operator for local calls, but automatic switching systems were expensive to install and maintain, required telephones with dial mechanisms instead of simple crank call systems, and couldn't easily handle complex tasks like long-distance operator assistance or conference calls. Through the 1890s and early 1900s, automatic and manual switching systems coexisted, with some cities adopting Stroger's technology while others continued using manual operators. The transition to fully automatic switching would take decades, and even then, Long-distance calls would require operator assistance until electronic switching systems emerged in the 1960s. As the telephone network grew more complex, it also grew more reliable and more essential. By 1900, businesses in major cities considered telephone service as fundamental as electricity or running water. Banks used telephones to verify account balances and coordinate transfers. Newspapers used telephones to gather news from remote reporters and call in stories for immediate publication. Police departments installed telephone systems to coordinate emergency responses across precincts. Hospitals used telephones to summon doctors for emergencies. The telephone had transformed from a luxury novelty to critical infrastructure in just 25 years. The social implications were equally profound. The telephone was creating new forms of intimacy and new forms of anxiety. Couples could maintain romantic relationships across distances that would have ended relationships in earlier eras. Parents could check on children away at school. Friends could gossip and share news without meeting in person. But this connectivity also created expectations that hadn't existed before. If you had a telephone, people expected you to be reachable. If you didn't answer, people worried or assumed you were deliberately avoiding them. The telephone gave birth to a new kind of social obligation, the expectation of availability. Women's lives were particularly transformed by telephone access. Before the telephone, leaving home for errands meant being completely disconnected from household concerns. A woman shopping downtown couldn't be reached if a child got sick at home, or if a tradesman arrived unexpectedly. The telephone created a tether, sometimes welcome, sometimes constraining, that kept women connected to domestic responsibilities even when physically absent. It also created new forms of women's social life. Telephone gossip became a cultural phenomenon, groups of women maintaining friendship networks through daily calls, sharing news and advice and support without needing to coordinate in-person meetings. The telephone was also changing business in ways no one had anticipated. Salesmen could contact far more potential customers by telephone than by traveling in person. Businesses could coordinate supply chains in real time, rather than through delayed correspondence. Stock exchanges could disseminate price information instantly to brokers across the country. The telephone was collapsing business time and space, creating a more integrated, faster-moving economy where information traveled at electrical speed rather than at the speed of trains and ships. By 1910, America had 5 million telephones, one for every 20 people, the highest penetration rate in the world. Europe had fewer telephones despite larger populations, partly because European telephone systems were often government-owned monopolies that charged higher prices and grew more slowly than America's privately owned competitive system. The American approach, encouraging competition initially, then consolidating into regulated monopolies, had produced rapid growth and innovation despite periodic chaos and inefficiency. The telephone network had become invisible infrastructure, something people used without thinking about the extraordinary engineering required to make it work. Pick up a telephone, ask the operator to connect you to someone across the country, and within minutes you're speaking to them as if they were in the same room. The complexity hiding behind that simple experience, the thousands of miles of wire, the hundreds of operators coordinating your connection, the electrical physics that allowed your voice to travel at nearly light speed, the decades of invention and refinement that made it all reliable, was completely hidden from users, which was exactly as it should be. The best infrastructure becomes invisible, present only in its absence, when service fails and the magic briefly stops working. Alexander Graham Bell spent 16 years in court defending his telephone patents, facing more than 600 separate lawsuits from inventors who claimed they'd invented the telephone first, from companies that wanted to manufacture telephones without paying royalties, and eventually from the United States government itself, which tried to annul Bell's patent-claiming fraud in its acquisition. These weren't simple legal disputes. They were battles over who would control the future of human communication and the billions of dollars that control would generate. The lawsuits began almost immediately after Bell received patent number 174,465. In March 1876, every inventor who'd ever experimented with electrical voice transmission suddenly remembered that they'd actually invented the telephone first, and Bell had merely stolen their ideas. Some claims had merit. Elisha Gray really had developed similar designs independently and had lost only because of filing date timing. Other claims were obvious attempts to extract settlement money from Bell's increasingly valuable company. And some claims existed in a gray area where parallel discovery made questions of priority genuinely ambiguous. The most serious early challenge came from Western Union's lawsuit machine. After settling with Bell in 1879 and agreeing to exit the telephone business, Western Union continued funding legal challenges from other inventors, hoping to invalidate Bell's patents through proxy battles. They backed Daniel Drawbaugh, a Pennsylvania tinkerer who claimed he'd invented a working telephone years before Bell, but had been too poor to file patents. Drawbaugh's case was compelling in some ways. He had witnesses who claimed they'd heard his telephone work as early as 1869, 7 years before Bell's patent, but his documentation was suspiciously absent, and his memory of crucial details was conveniently vague. The Drawbaugh case reached the Supreme Court in 1888, with Bell's entire fortune and the future of the telephone industry hanging on the decision. Bell had to testify extensively, explaining his invention's development in exhaustive detail, producing notebooks and correspondence and prototypes to prove he'd genuinely developed his telephone through systematic research rather than theft. The Supreme Court justices, most of whom barely understood electricity, had to evaluate competing technical claims about electromagnetic induction, variable resistance, and acoustic physics. The court ruled 4-3 in Bell's favor, the narrowest possible margin. The majority opinion stated that while Drawbaugh might have experimented with voice transmission devices, he'd failed to reduce his invention to practice in a reliable, documented way that would establish priority. Bell had done the systematic work of true invention, documenting experiments, refining designs, demonstrating reproducible results, while Drawbaugh had tinkered without discipline. That one-vote margin saved Bell's patents and ensured the Bell Telephone Company would control American telecommunications for decades. Had the vote gone the other way, Bell's patents would have been invalidated. The telephone would have become unpatented public domain technology, and the entire telecommunications industry would have developed differently. But winning in court destroyed something in Bell personally. The 16 years of litigation, the endless testimony, the lawyers dissecting every word he'd ever written about his invention, the opposing attorneys suggesting he was a fraud and a thief. It broke his relationship with the telephone itself. He'd invented the device to connect people, to carry human voices across impossible distances, to give sound to those he loved despite their deafness. Instead, the telephone had become the mechanism of his torment and the source of legal warfare that consumed years of his life. Bell increasingly refused to use telephones at all. He'd have assistants take calls and relay messages. He'd communicate through letters and telegrams when possible. His study at his estate in Baddeck, Nova Scotia, where he'd retreat for months at a time to escape the telephone company's demands, had no telephone installed despite being the home of the telephone's inventor. When visitors expressed surprise or amusement at this, Bell would respond with barely controlled bitterness. "I never used the beast." The invention that made him famous had become his personal enemy. His relationship with the deaf community became equally complex and painful. Bell had married Mabel Hubbard specifically because her deafness hadn't destroyed her ability to communicate. She read lips perfectly, spoke clearly, and functioned in hearing society without difficulty. But Mabel's success with oral communication methods made Bell believe that all deaf people should pursue oralism, learning to speak and read lips, rather than using sign language. This belief, which started as preference based on his family's experience, hardened into ideology that would haunt his legacy. Bell became the leading advocate for oralism in late 19th century America, arguing that deaf people should be taught to speak and integrate into hearing society, rather than forming separate deaf communities using sign language. He believed, sincerely but wrongly, that sign language isolated deaf people, limited their opportunities, and should be eliminated. He lobbied against deaf teachers in schools for the deaf, arguing that deaf educators using sign language would perpetuate deaf culture rather than assimilating deaf children into the hearing world. He advocated against deaf people marrying each other, fearing that hereditary deafness would spread, and suggested that society should actively work to prevent the formation of a deaf variety of the human race. These views, expressed in lectures and publications through the 1880s and 1890s, made Bell simultaneously a hero and a villain in deaf history. He'd funded schools for deaf children, employed deaf people, married a deaf woman, and dedicated significant effort to improving deaf education. But his insistence on oralism and his opposition to sign language and deaf culture caused immeasurable harm. Many deaf children were prohibited from using sign language, even though oral methods didn't work for them, leaving them isolated and unable to communicate effectively in any language. Deaf teachers lost jobs. Deaf communities were told their language and culture were defective and should be eliminated. The damage from Bell's advocacy lasted generations. The deepest irony was that Bell's own mother and wife, the deaf women he loved most, never heard his voice through his invention. His mother, Eliza, had died in 1897, deaf for the last 45 years of her life, never experiencing the telephone that her son's childhood observations of her deafness had partly inspired. Mabel lived with Bell for 45 years of marriage, bore his children, managed his business affairs during his most chaotic litigation years, and supported his endless experimental projects. But she never heard his voice through a telephone, never experienced the emotional intimacy of remote conversation that the telephone made possible for hearing people. The telephone transmitted voices acoustic information, but was useless for the deaf. Bell had revolutionized communication for the hearing world while doing nothing to help those he claimed to care about most. This contradiction drove Bell to other inventions, other attempts to bridge the gap between sound and silence. In 1880, he developed the photophone, a device that transmitted sound on beams of light instead of through electrical wires. The photophone worked by vibrating a mirror with sound waves, which modulated reflected sunlight. A receiver some distance away detected the light variations and converted them back to sound. It was brilliant physics, predicting fiber optic communication by nearly a century, but completely impractical with 1880s technology. The device required direct line of sight, didn't work in fog or rain or darkness, and had no obvious advantages over wire-based telephones. Bell considered it his greatest invention, more important than the telephone, partly because it was purely his work, without the legal complications, and partly because it represented new physics rather than mere engineering refinement. In 1881, President James Garfield was shot by an assassin and lay dying slowly over several weeks, while doctors searched unsuccessfully for the bullet lodged somewhere in his torso. Bell frantically built a metal detector, an electromagnetic device that would produce different tones when near metal objects, hoping to locate the bullet and guide surgeons. He rushed to the White House with his hastily constructed detector and scanned the president's body methodically while doctors and family watched desperately. The device worked perfectly in laboratory tests, but it failed completely at the president's bedside, detecting nothing, providing no useful information. Garfield died on September 19, 1881, and only later did investigators realize Bell's metal detector had been confused by the metal bed springs supporting the president's mattress, springs no one had thought to remove or account for. Bell had built a working metal detector and correctly applied it, but basic oversight had rendered it useless when it mattered most. This pattern repeated throughout Bell's later life. Brilliant inventions that worked in principle but failed in practice, or succeeded technically but found no market, or solved problems no one actually had. He designed tetrahedral kites, structures built from triangular cells that were remarkably strong and stable, and successfully flew human-carrying kites in experiments through the early 1900s. The kites were beautiful, complex geometric structures that looked like three-dimensional snowflakes, and they worked exactly as Bell predicted. But airplanes using conventional wing designs proved more practical, and Bell's kites became a fascinating dead end in aviation history. He built hydrofoil boats that used underwater wings to lift hulls above water, dramatically reducing drag and increasing speed. His HD-4 hydrofoil set a water speed record of over 70 miles per hour in 1919, a record that stood for years. The hydrofoil was genuinely innovative and would eventually become important in military and commercial shipping, but in Bell's lifetime it remained an experimental curiosity. He experimented with breeding sheep to produce animals with multiple nipples that could feed more lambs, achieving some success in increasing lamb survival rates, but contributing nothing to telecommunications. He tried teaching dogs to speak, achieving only comical failures that might have embarrassed a lesser scientist. Each project showed Bell's restless genius seeking new outlets, new ways to impact the world beyond the telephone that had made him famous but also trapped him. He couldn't escape being the telephone inventor no matter what else he achieved. Journalists covering his hydrofoil boats would still lead with Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone. Today demonstrated as if his identity was permanently fixed by that one achievement decades earlier. And perhaps it was. Perhaps inventing something that transformed human civilization meant being forever defined by that transformation regardless of anything else you accomplished. Bell's notebooks from his later years show a man chasing increasingly scattered ideas: optical telecommunications, solar energy collection, desalination technologies, aircraft design, genetic inheritance in sheep, teaching methods for the deaf, atmospheric kite photography. Some ideas were ahead of their time and would prove important decades later. Others were dead ends, but all of them shared a quality of restless searching, as if Bell was trying to outrun the shadow of his one perfect creation, trying to prove to himself and the world that he was more than just the telephone inventor. His final years were spent mostly at his estate in Nova Scotia, a sprawling property on Cape Breton Island where he could work without interruption and without telephones, unless absolutely necessary. He built laboratories there, hangars for his kites and aircraft experiments, breeding facilities for his sheep research. It was a kingdom of invention where Bell could be the person he'd been before the telephone made him famous, a curious experimenter following ideas wherever they led, unencumbered by business demands or legal battles or the constant interruptions of fame. Mabel managed their financial affairs, handled correspondence, dealt with the Bell Telephone Company's periodic requests for Bell's presence at celebrations or exhibitions. She was the buffer between Bell's need for solitude and the world's demand for the telephone inventor's time and attention. Their relationship had become a partnership of necessity as much as love. She managed the practical world while he pursued impossible projects, each dependent on the other in ways that perhaps neither could fully acknowledge. On August 1st, 1922, Bell suffered complications from diabetes that had plagued him for years. He was 75 years old, internationally famous, wealthy, accomplished far beyond what most people achieve in 10 lifetimes. But he was also exhausted, ready to be done, ready for the rest that fame and accomplishment had never allowed. Mabel sat with him through his final hours. They couldn't converse the way telephone-connected people could. She read his lips, he signed to her. They communicated in their private language developed over 45 years of marriage. And when Bell died on August 2nd, 1922, at 2 a.m, Mabel was holding his hand, connected to him in silence. The funeral was held on August 4th in Baddeck. It was a simple service, Nothing grand, just family and close friends and local community members who'd known Bell as a neighbor and employer rather than as a historical figure. But at 6:25 p.m., the moment of Bell's burial, something extraordinary happened across North America. Every telephone fell silent. The American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which had grown from Bell's tiny startup into a telecommunications colossus serving millions of subscribers, had requested that all telephone service cease for 1 minute during Bell's burial. It was an unprecedented act, deliberately interrupting service across an entire continent to honor the man who'd made that service possible. At 6:25 p.m. Eastern Time, operators across America and Canada disconnected all calls, refused to complete new connections, and let the network fall silent for 1 minute. 13 million telephones, the descendants of that crude liquid transmitter that had first transmitted Mr. Watson. "Come here, I want to see you," held their breath. Business calls mid-sentence were interrupted. Emergency services stopped answering. Long-distance connections went dead. Personal conversations between friends and lovers were cut off mid-word. The entire telephone system, which existed to carry voices across distance, went silent to honor the man who'd taught it to speak. Consider what that silence represented. 13 million telephones, each one a doorway to instant connection with millions of other people, all simultaneously closed. The network that had murdered distance and eliminated isolation, that had transformed human communication from local to global, that had given our species the ability to speak across impossible separations, all of it stopped. For 1 minute, the world returned to 1847, to the moment before Bell's birth, to a time when voices could travel only as far as lungs could push them through air. And in that silence, perhaps people noticed what they'd stopped noticing long ago, the miracle that when you pick up a telephone and speak, someone hundreds or thousands of miles away can hear you as if you were standing beside them. Then at 6:26 p.m., the minute ended. Operators reconnected calls. The network resumed its endless conversation. 13 million telephones began speaking again, carrying millions of voices across the continent Bell had helped to wire, conducting the symphony of human connection that he'd made possible, but had grown to hate. The man was buried, the invention lived on, and the revolution he'd started, the transformation of human communication from local to global, from delayed to instant, from isolated to connected, continued accelerating toward a future even Bell couldn't have imagined. When Alexander Graham Bell died in 1922, the telephone network he'd created had already grown far beyond anything he'd imagined during those desperate nights in his Boston laboratory. 13 million telephones connected across North America represented just the beginning of a transformation that would reshape human civilization as profoundly as writing, printing, or agriculture. But Bell couldn't have known, and perhaps wouldn't have wanted to know, how completely his invention would devour distance, demolish privacy, and rebuild human society around the assumption of constant connection. The telephone in 1922 was still recognizably related to Bell's original design. You picked up a handset, asked an operator to connect you, spoke into a transmitter that converted your voice to electrical signals, and listened through a receiver that converted those signals back to sound. The physics were the same. The experience was fundamentally similar to what Bell and Watson had achieved in 1876. But everything else had changed. The telephone had stopped being a remarkable invention and had become invisible infrastructure, as unremarkable and essential as running water. By 1930, America had 20 million telephones, one for every 6 people. The network had become dense enough that most people could reach most other people with a single call. Automatic switching systems were replacing human operators for local calls, making the experience faster and more private. You could dial numbers directly without explaining to an operator who you wanted to reach. Long-distance calls still required operator assistance, but even those connections happened faster than they had a decade earlier. The telephone was becoming more efficient, more reliable, more ubiquitous. Then came technologies that Bell would have recognized as his telephone's children, but wouldn't have predicted. Radio broadcasting in the 1920s used electromagnetic waves to carry voices without wires, fulfilling the promise of wireless telephony that inventors had chased since the 1880s. Radio stations could transmit one voice or performance to millions of receivers simultaneously, a one-to-many communication model completely different from the telephone's one-to-one connections. Yet the underlying principle was the same: convert sound to electromagnetic energy, transmit that energy through space or wire, convert it back to sound. Bell's invention had learned to fly. Television in the 1940s added pictures to transmitted sound, creating a medium that combined radio's broadcast model with the intimate presence of human faces and bodies. Watching television felt like peering through a window into distant places, seeing events happen in real time despite hundreds or thousands of miles of separation. The technology was vastly more complex than Bell's telephone, requiring electron beams, phosphorescent screens, precise synchronization of image and sound. But the core concept remained: eliminate distance by transmitting information at electromagnetic speed. The telephone itself continued evolving. Transistors in the 1950s replaced vacuum tubes, making equipment smaller, more reliable, and less power-hungry. Touch-tone dialing in the 1960s replaced rotary dials, sending audio tones instead of mechanical pulses to control switching systems. Direct distance dialing eliminated operator assistance for most long-distance calls, letting anyone call anyone anywhere without human intermediaries. The telephone was becoming more automated, more impersonal, more efficient at connecting voices while eliminating the human intelligence that operators had provided. Satellites in orbit beginning in the 1960s enabled telephone calls to bounce off the sky, linking continents without submarine cables, connecting any place on Earth to any other place through relays floating in space. The Telstar satellite, launched in 1962, was essentially a telephone repeater station orbiting Earth at 17,000 miles per hour, catching signals from one continent and bouncing them to another. Bell's invention had escaped Earth's surface entirely, spreading through space like sound filling a room. Fiber optic cables in the 1970s and 80s fulfilled the promise of Bell's photophone, using pulses of light, traveling through glass strands to carry thousands of conversations simultaneously. The physics were exactly what Bell had demonstrated in 1880. Sound modulating light, light carrying information, light converting back to sound, but with lasers and ultra-pure glass instead of vibrating mirrors and sunlight. Bell had seen the principle, but lacked the technology. A century later, the technology caught up to his vision. Mobile phones in the 1980s untethered telephones from walls and wires completely, letting people carry telecommunications devices in their pockets. The first mobile phones were crude, heavy, expensive, with terrible audio quality and coverage, but they proved a principle that would reshape society. People wanted to be reachable anywhere, anytime, regardless of location. The telephone had become personal rather than locational. You didn't call a place and hope the person you wanted was there. You called a person directly, reaching them wherever they happened to be. The Internet in the 1990s transformed telephone networks into data networks, carrying not just voices but text, images, videos, and eventually entire virtual worlds through the same infrastructure that had once carried only phone calls. The telephone network became the substrate for a new kind of global nervous system, where every computer could connect to every other computer, sharing information at speeds that made even real-time voice seem slow. What had started as a way to send voices through wires had become the foundation for humanity's collective consciousness. And then, smartphones, the culmination of everything Bell's invention had spawned. The device in your pocket right now if you own a smartphone, contains more computing power than existed in the entire world when Bell died. It's a telephone, yes, capable of voice calls just like Bell's original invention. But it's also a camera, a television, a radio, a library, a map, a compass, a calculator, a typewriter, a newspaper, a movie theater, a music player, a video conferencing system, and a portal to essentially all human knowledge. It's connected wirelessly to billions of other devices, able to reach any person or any information anywhere on Earth in seconds. This device, this hyper-evolved telephone, is what Bell's liquid transmitter became. The path from "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," to video calls with someone on the other side of Earth took less than 150 years. In the vast sweep of human history, that's instantaneous. For millions of years, human communication was limited to the range of the voice and the speed of travel. For thousands of years, after writing was invented, communication was limited by how fast you could physically transport messages. And then in one historical eye blink, less than 2 human lifetimes, we went from voices trapped by distance to universal instant connection. Consider what this means for human experience. A person born in 1847, the year of Bell's birth, would have grown up in a world where if someone you loved moved 100 miles away, you lost daily contact with them completely. You might exchange letters every few weeks. You might visit once a year if you were wealthy enough to afford train travel. But day-to-day connection was impossible. Distance meant isolation as an unchangeable fact of existence. That same person, if they lived to 90, would die in 1937 in a world where you could pick up a telephone and speak to someone on the other side of the continent, hearing their voice as clearly as if they stood beside you, maintaining intimate relationships across distances that would have ended those relationships just decades earlier. The fundamental nature of human connection had changed within a single lifetime, and it changed because of Bell's invention. And if you could somehow bring that person forward to today, if you could show them what the telephone became, they'd witness something close to magic. Show them a video call where you see and hear someone in real time, despite being on different continents. Show them how you can send a text message that reaches its destination in seconds anywhere on Earth. Show them how you can share photos and videos of your life instantly with dozens or thousands of people. Show them how you carry in your pocket the ability to reach essentially any person and access essentially any information at any time. They'd struggle to process how completely the world had transformed. But here's what's remarkable. We barely notice any of this. The miracle has become mundane. You pick up your phone, tap a contact, and have a video conversation with someone 10,000 miles away, and it feels completely ordinary. You send a message that circles the planet in less than a second, and you're annoyed if the response takes more than a few minutes. You have immediate access to more information than existed in all the libraries of the ancient world, and you use it to watch videos of cats or argue with strangers about politics. Bell would probably recognize this paradox. He invented something that should have filled people with wonder: voices traveling through wires, presence without physical proximity, the defeat of distance itself, and instead people came to take it for granted, to see it as ordinary, even to resent it when it demanded their attention. The telephone that Bell grew to hate had multiplied into billions of devices that people simultaneously depend on and complain about, can't live without but wish they could escape from. The deeper transformation isn't technological, it's psychological. The telephone and its descendants have rebuilt human consciousness around the assumption of connection. Before Bell, isolation was normal and connection was the exception. You were usually alone or with the few people physically near you, and occasional connection with distant people was special, carefully arranged, significant. After Bell, connection became normal and isolation became the exception. You're expected to be reachable. If you don't answer your phone, people worry or get annoyed. If you deliberately disconnect, it requires explanation and justification. This shift has profound implications we're still processing. Mental health researchers study how constant connectivity affects anxiety and depression. Sociologists examine how digital communication changes intimacy and friendship. Philosophers debate whether we've gained more than we've lost by trading some solitude for perpetual availability. There are no clear answers because we're living through the transformation Bell started, and we can't yet see where it leads, but we can see where it's led so far. Bell's telephone created the infrastructure for everything that came after. Radio and television broadcasting used telephone network technology and principles. The internet was built on top of telephone infrastructure, using phone lines and telephone switching concepts to create global data networks. Mobile phones evolved from telephone concepts, adding wireless transmission to Bell's core insight about electrical voice transmission. Smartphones combined all of this into pocket-sized devices that are transforming human civilization in real time. Every video call, every text message, every social media post, every streaming video, every email, every GPS navigation, every online transaction, all of it traces its ancestry back to that March afternoon in 1876, when Bell spilled acid on his clothes and shouted for Watson. The thread connecting that moment to this present is unbroken. Bell's invention didn't just change communication, it changed what it means to be human in a connected world. The telephone's true revolution wasn't technical, it was philosophical. Bell proved that distance was negotiable, that isolation was optional, that the human voice could transcend the prison of physical space. Before Bell, you could only speak to people within reach of your breath, and that fundamental limitation shaped all human experience. After Bell, your voice could circle the earth in seconds, reaching any human on the planet as easily as reaching the person next to you. That change remade human civilization more profoundly than most political revolutions or military conquests. Standing here in this present moment, with billions of people carrying devices that can connect them instantly to billions of other people, it's worth pausing to feel the weight of what Bell started. Every conversation you have with someone far away, every video you share, every message you send across distance, these are miracles that violate the fundamental rules that governed human existence for our entire history as a species. We've been disconnected by distance for millions of years and connected across distance for barely 150 years. We're still learning what that means, what it does to us, how to be human in a world where no one is ever truly far away. Bell himself never fully understood what he'd created. He saw the telephone as a device for transmitting voices through wires, useful for business and coordination, interesting for its physics. He couldn't have anticipated that he was building the foundation for humanity's collective nervous system, the substrate for a global consciousness where every person could potentially connect to every other person, where information could flow at light speed between any 2 points on Earth, where distance would become essentially meaningless for communication. He definitely didn't anticipate that his invention would become something people would hate as much as love, would depend on desperately while wishing they could escape, would use constantly while complaining about constantly. The telephone that Bell came to call the Beast has multiplied into billions of beasts, all demanding attention, all offering connection, all making the ancient human experience of solitude harder to achieve and harder to maintain. And yet, despite the complications, despite the costs, despite everything we've lost in gaining constant connection, Bell's invention remains one of humanity's genuine achievements. He murdered distance. He gave us the power to speak across impossible separations. He made presence without proximity possible for the first time in human history. Every person you love who lives far away, but whose voice you can hear whenever you choose, that's Bell's gift. Every emergency call that saves a life by reaching help instantly, that's Bell's gift. Every conversation that maintains a relationship across miles that would have ended that relationship in any previous era. That's Bell's gift. The price has been high. We've traded some privacy for connection. We've traded some depth for breadth. We've traded some peace for availability. We're still figuring out whether the bargain was worth it. But we can't unmake the bargain now. The world Bell created, the connected world, the wired world, the world where every voice can reach every ear, is the only world we know. And it's the world that will continue evolving, probably toward even greater connection, even less isolation, even more complete transformation of what it means to be human and alone and together all at once. Bell's final irony is this. He tried to escape his invention, to be more than just the telephone inventor, to prove he could create other things equally important. He failed at that escape, and he probably knew he'd failed. But his failure doesn't diminish him, it elevates him. Some inventions are so profound, they eclipse everything else their inventor accomplishes. Some ideas reshape civilization so completely that their creator becomes permanently identified with that reshaping. Bell invented the telephone, and in doing so, invented the connected world we inhabit. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. When those 13 million telephones fell silent for 1 minute on August 4th, 1922, they were acknowledging something simple and profound. The world had changed because of what Bell created, and it would never change back. The silence was temporary. The transformation was permanent. And every voice that has traveled through wire or air or light since that moment, every conversation that has crossed impossible distances, every connection that distance should have prevented, all of it echoes with Bell's first words transmitted through his crude liquid transmitter on a March afternoon in 1876. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you. We came. We've been coming ever since, crossing distances that should separate us, speaking to people we should never reach, building connections that physics should make impossible. We're all still coming, still reaching across the void, still using the magic Bell taught us, that voices can fly, that distance can die, that the human need to speak and be heard, can overcome any separation, can bridge any gap, can connect any consciousness to any other across the vast and formerly isolating space between souls. That's Bell's legacy. Not the device itself. Devices become obsolete. Not the company that bore his name. Companies rise and fall. Not even the specific technology. Technology evolves beyond recognition. His legacy is the idea that became infrastructure, became assumption, became the foundation of modern human existence. We are connected. Distance doesn't separate us anymore. Isolation is a choice rather than an inevitability. Any voice can reach any ear, anywhere, anytime. The human species learned to speak across the void, and we're still learning what that means. Still exploring what becomes possible when no one is ever truly far away. Still becoming whatever humans become when distance dies and connection becomes the permanent condition of existence. Bell's revolution continues. The echoes of that first transmitted sentence still ripple through everything we've built since. And those echoes will keep traveling, keep spreading, keep transforming us, until we've become something our ancestors would barely recognize, a species that has conquered distance and learned to exist in perpetual connection, for better and worse, in ways Bell invented but never fully understood, carrying forward the revolution he started when he taught voices how to travel through wire, and changed what it means to be human and alone and together forever.